Hi, I'm Charlene Collins Freeman, and welcome to my watercolor tutorial for painting a still life with pomegranate. The supplies I use for this painting include Arches hot press watercolor paper, 140 pounds, 9 by 12 inches, 23 by 31 centimeters. For my drawing, I used a 2H pencil and a kneaded eraser. My watercolor brushes are a black gold 311 size 0 and a Princeton Heritage Series 4050 round size 6, water container paper towels, and a small spray bottle filled with water. All my watercolor paints are Daniel Smith. I used yellow ochre, burnt sienna, quinacridone burnt orange, alizarin crimson, French ultramarine, and undersea green. The reference photo I've used for this painting comes from pixabay.com. Pixabay.com is a great resource for artists. Most of the photographs on this website are both copyright free and attribution free. Here's my line drawing for this painting. I've enhanced the contrast so that it will show up better in the video, but do keep your pencil lines quite light. I don't want my pencil lines to show through my paint, although there are many watercolor artists who don't mind that and even might go back in and re-emphasize their pencil lines after they have finished painting. So I'm ready to begin, and I start off by rolling my kneaded eraser across my drawing to further lighten up my pencil lines. I start off with the larger of my brushes, the black gold, to paint in all the largest shapes. I'll start off with those leaves in the background, and I mix yellow ochre with undersea green. I don't overmix on my palette. You can see how I just put the two colors into each other and brush stroke back and forth a couple of times, and then begin painting. Notice that as I start painting these leaves, I'm not outlining the whole shape of the leaf and then coloring it in, so to speak, but rather I'm painting entire sections, one at a time. I'm also choosing whether I'm painting the back side of a leaf, the curled over side. I don't want to paint all of the leaf and have all of these colors bleed together. That'll give me one big shape of this greenish color, but I also want to see hard edges between the front of the leaf, the shadow of the leaf. So I paint one section, let it dry, and then come in and paint the other half of that leaf. And for variety, be sure you're not always dipping just into that puddle of mixed green on your palette. Notice how here I'm just picking up yellow ochre right out of the well and dipping it into some areas of this leaf. When we look at nature and you pick up a leaf, you'll notice that it's not the same exact green every square inch of that leaf. There's a variety of color, and I want to capture that in my painting. So I don't worry about creating a puddle big enough on my palette to paint all of the leaves. I just start with a small puddle and then add either more yellow or more green to it as I continue painting. Here you see me painting little sections of leaves that are poking out between other parts of the leaves. These are sort of behind the bigger leaf forms. I'll get these painted in and then give them a chance to dry before I come in and paint the rest of the bigger leaf forms around them. And we'll have a nice variety of both color and hard edges. By a hard edge, I mean where you can definitely see where one part of the leaf is butting up against another part of the leaf, as opposed to just having all the colors melt together. Next, I pick up a little bit of French ultramarine blue and add it into the mix. This is for the darker areas I see of some of the leaves that are curled over and are in shadow. I'm having to make up some of the areas that I'm painting now because I chose to leave out the branches that we see in our reference photo. I thought they looked sort of funny at a weird angle, and I just chose to leave them out. So I'm putting in more of the shadowy area in these sections. I added the French ultramarine blue by just adding it directly from my palette into the painting while the yellow-green mixture was still wet, so that they blended together on the paper rather than on the palette. In fact, you'll notice that I did not add my blue to that puddle of yellow-green. I'm keeping them separate so that I can dip my brush first in one color and then in another to keep making variety. The puddle I just mixed now is yellow ochre with burnt sienna. And I'm using that to give a first layer to my walnuts. You can see just how watery my mix is on my palette. And I'm doing that on purpose to keep this first layer quite light. Then I can build up both more color and texture as I do second or third layers. Next, I want to paint the chestnuts, and they're decidedly darker. So for those, I use a mixture of burnt sienna and French ultramarine. And you can see that this puddle is thicker, therefore darker. Notice my brush strokes are going in the direction of the texture I see in that first chestnut that's facing us. We see these little highlights that are going from the bottom lower left up slightly to the right corner. So I painted the brush strokes in that direction and just left some of the white of the paper to show through as those highlights. Again, I did not make a puddle big enough to paint all 4 of these chestnuts. I just made a puddle, and then if I run out of paint as I'm painting along, I just add either more burnt sienna to it, like I did now, or French ultramarine. Again, this gives me a nice variety in this dark brown as I paint in these chestnuts. And you'll notice also in this one, the direction of my brush strokes imitate the direction of the highlights that I see, and then I leave the white of the paper. Now those highlights will be really stark, and we'll come in later and soften them, but for now I'll leave them. I didn't paint the 4th chestnut because it touches up against the others that I've painted and they're still wet. If I paint that 4th one at the same time, I won't get a nice hard edge between chestnuts. So instead, I turn my attention to those yellowy sections inside the pomegranate. And for this, instead of introducing yet another yellow, I'm sticking to just yellow ochre and very watery, painting it in as I see those yellow sections. Now I've added just a touch of quinacridone burnt orange to that yellow, because some of those sections in the pomegranate have a more reddish cast. Now I mix a little bit more of undersea green into my yellow ochre and start painting some of that section at the very bottom of the pomegranate that has more of a green cast to it. I'm sticking to just these 6 colors to have a limited palette. Limited palettes ensure that your painting will have color harmony, as opposed to introducing new colors and ending up with a palette of 15 colors at the end. That can really be off-putting. Your color harmony can be lost. It's better to stick to a limited number of colors and then just mix what you need for your painting. I'm waiting for the walnuts to dry, the chestnuts to dry, those yellow sections in the pomegranate to dry. So now I'm going in and painting the rest of the leaf sections. I'm adding quinacridone burnt orange into the color mix for our leaves. On this first section that I'm painting now, I used a very watery layer of quinacridone burnt orange, and now I'm touching very watery undersea green into it. Notice I'm just sort of stippling the paint in there. I'm not brush stroking back and forth, back and forth. I'm stippling in the green right on top of that burnt orange while it's still damp. And I'm letting the colors mix on their own on the paper. Now I need to let that section dry, so I go and find another section of the leaf to paint. And I pick up that watery mix of undersea green, yellow ochre with just a touch of burnt orange. This quinacridone burnt orange is just a beautiful color, and I'm looking for ways to use it in this painting. Adding it to the leaves really subtly is working well. I go back to that first section and touch in more color. As it's drying, I feel like it's getting too light. So I just touched in a little bit more of the same colors I've used up till now. Now I go back to painting that last walnut. Back to a watery mix of mostly burnt sienna with a touch of yellow ochre in it. Because the other walnuts are dry, I can paint right up against them and still have a nice defined hard edge between the 3 walnuts. I pick up more quinacridone burnt orange and touch just a little bit of undersea green into it. Again, I'm showing you my palette so you can see just how watery my mixes are and how separate I keep my puddles. And I start painting in more sections of the leaf. I study my reference photo as I paint these in, and the sections I'm painting will either have more of an orange hue or of a green hue or yellow or blue. So I can keep dipping my brush into the different puddles I've created on my palette to capture those differences. Paying attention to those slight shifts in color will make all the difference in making your leaves more interesting and more three-dimensional. So again, I'm at a point where I need to let these sections dry, and I'll turn my attention finally to that pomegranate. I love that pop of alizarin crimson right in the middle of this still life. And because it's quite dark, notice how thick the paint is on my palette. I've made a small puddle and it's just straight alizarin crimson. And I want to show you, let's get up closer, how I'm painting the red parts of the interior of this pomegranate. First, I'm loading my brush up with quite a bit of alizarin crimson. It's at a milky consistency. And I'm painting quickly around the seeds as I see them. I think of this almost as a calligraphy brushstroke. In some areas, I can see the red around each seed, but in other areas, I just see abstract shapes that are quite dark red. So I'm following the reference photo somewhat closely, but I'm not doing this with a small brush. I'm not getting overly detailed. And notice I'm painting with just the tip of my brush. The more perpendicular you hold your brush to the paper, that is to say the more straight up and down, with a light touch, you can really get some thin marks off of that tip. And I'm moving quickly. I really want to just capture the impression of these seeds. While I am making up some of the seeds, I'm certainly not counting how many are in the reference photo and then counting how many I'm painting. But I am keeping an eye on that reference photo. I don't want to entirely start making up the pattern I see in this pomegranate. When I start making things up, I'm drawing more from memory or laziness, and it just usually doesn't look as great as it does when I'm keeping my eye on that reference photo and really studying it, getting as close as I can without getting overly detailed. I'm pretty mesmerized by the pattern this is making, this stark alizarin crimson against that white. But we will come in and soften this later and add more color to those white areas. But for now, I want to give this dark alizarin crimson a chance to soak into my paper. As I work my way around the pomegranate, some areas have much darker alizarin crimson than other areas. And that's just a matter of adding a touch more water to my puddle and getting lighter paint for some of the areas. Again, we're going for that variety. And then I'm ready to paint the dark skin on the exterior of the pomegranate. The color on the exterior of the pomegranate is considerably darker than the interior, so I mix up a thick puddle of alizarin crimson with a touch of French ultramarine blue. In some areas, it's almost bordering on purple. Be sure that any areas that you are brushing up against are completely dry at this point. We don't want this dark reddish color bleeding into the walnuts or the leaves. Notice I leave a thin sliver of white paper between the dark skin of the exterior and the seeds of the interior. We'll come in later and soften that up and add just a little bit of color, but it helps show that there's a thickness of that skin. While I have this thick mixture on my brush, I darken up some sections of the interior of the pomegranate. Then I go back to mixing burnt sienna with French ultramarine blue. It's that nice dark color for the chestnuts, and I can come in and paint that fourth chestnut now that the other ones around it are completely dry. I decide to use the same color to do a second layer on the other chestnuts we painted earlier to darken them up a bit. Watercolors do tend to fade as they dry, and these got a little bit lighter than I wanted. Now I'm creating a very watery mix of French ultramarine with just a touch of that mixture we used for the chestnuts in it. And I'm painting the final details that we see on the edges of these chestnuts. I added a little bit of burnt sienna and water to that mix that we used for the chestnuts, and I'm using that to create the shadow shapes and some suggestion of details on the walnuts now. Notice the puddles I'm working with go from thick to watery, and that gives you the difference between which colors are going down really dark and which sections are going down lighter. I'm really using the same colors for all of these details. If I want them to be lighter, I need to add water to my mix. My brush strokes are sort of scumbly to create that scumbly, rough texture that we see on walnuts. Then I dry off my brush. It's completely clean. I dry it off and I use it as a sponge to lift out highlights in those three walnuts. That helps give them a three-dimensional look as well. And then I do the same thing with the chestnuts. I rinse out my brush to be sure it's clean, and then I wipe it dry on my towel. I want it just barely damp for this lifting technique. I lift paint out and then wipe that off on my towel as well. This lifting technique can give you really lovely soft highlights. And then it's time to go in and do that pomegranate. So for the interior of the pomegranate, I want to show that there's a little bit of yellow cast to it. Notice how I water down yellow ochre, and with a very light touch, I come in and I start dotting it or stippling it into those white seeds. This has the effect of loosening up some of that alizarin crimson we've already painted, which is what I want. It has the illusion of creating the texture of those seeds without having to belabor each and every one. The important thing is to go lightly with your brush and try to scuffle around. If you paint with long horizontal or vertical strokes, you'll end up losing all that work we did earlier to create the sort of structure of the seeds. Then, using very watery alizarin crimson, I come in and paint that thickness of the skin that we had left earlier as the white of the paper. And there we have our lovely pomegranate. Once it's dry, we can come in and drop in some more dark markings if we need to reestablish some of the structure between the seeds. But now I'm going in to do my background. I've decided to ignore that tabletop line that is both in the reference photo and in my drawing. I will use only the colors that we've already used in our painting to paint in an abstract background of just these colors flowing into each other. Painting on hot press paper makes this kind of background easier to manage than cold press paper. It's just that our paint remains on the surface a little bit longer than it does with cold press paper. I tend to like making the corners darker and then in the center a lighter background. In photography, it's called vignetting, and it draws the attention to the subject in the center. While I do want to mix some of these colors, I also want some of the colors to show up as pure colors from the painting. When we mix them, we start graying them down. So for the most part, this background will be neutral. But you'll notice I did a big brush stroke of alizarin crimson, and then I'll put in some brush strokes of just yellow ochre, so that our background will be both a combination of mixed colors and pure colors. Again, it's important to have color harmony in our paintings, and we don't want to just introduce all new colors in a background. I find that often backgrounds are really tricky for people. They end up introducing a whole new color scheme, which really has the opposite effect. We want the background to be connected to our subject and draw attention to the subject. But when you paint it with a completely different color scheme or different style, it ends up working against your subject instead of in favor of it. Notice the paints on my palette at this point are much thicker. They're not that watery consistency. They're going from milky and in some areas even creamy to get those darks that I want. Of course, as I paint the background, my subject is completely dry and I'm not bleeding them into each other. I also want my background to start off darker at the top and then become much lighter as it comes down, so that I do create the illusion of a tabletop without the hard edge drawn in. I'm working on both sides of the background, that upper right corner and then the lower left corner. I don't want to just ignore one and end up having a hard edge where I stopped painting. And then I'm coming in and painting all those negative spaces that are the background in our painting, especially between the leaves. In a way, I'm cleaning up my palette right at this point. I'm using up all the colors that are already on it. However, notice that my puddles are still relatively separate from each other. If I were to mix them all together, I would end up with one homogenized neutral color, probably leaning towards gray. And I don't really want just a gray background. I want a colorful background that incorporates all of these colors. To make sure it's not too psychedelic of an experience, mixing colors together will neutralize them. So I definitely want big areas of neutral purples and blues, which I'm getting from mixing my French ultramarine and my alizarin crimson, and to a certain extent, the quinacridone burnt orange. But I'm really picking up all the colors on my palette. Here you see me painting around one leaf shape that I forgot to paint earlier. And that's okay. Once the background is dry, I can come in and paint it. Notice how my colors of my background are getting lighter as I work my way down. And that's just a matter of adding water to my mixes that are already on my palette. I paint carefully when I'm painting right up against my subject, but I do paint right up against it. Be sure you're not shy about that. I find that often students will leave a little white paper between their background and their subject because they're worried about loosening up the paint in their subject. But I think a little bit of paint from your subject bleeding into your background is a better look for watercolors than leaving a little white piece of paper that creates a halo around your subject. So just paint right up against it as best you can. The more watery your paint is, like the watery mixtures I use for the bottom portion of my background, the more likely I am to loosen up paint from my subject. So I'm really careful with really wet paint. I darken the corner a little bit and then I pick up my spray bottle. Very carefully, I spray just the background, avoiding the pomegranate and the leaves, tilting my paper for just a minute. This has the effect of softening those colors into each other even more. And while those colors settle down, I go in and paint that last leaf. Now we're down to the final details. I've picked up my Princeton brush, which is the smaller of the two brushes. Again, I'm not introducing any new colors. I'm using the colors already on my palette. And this is a grayish color that is really a combination of many of the colors already on my palette. And I'm painting in just the suggestion of leaves. I'm keeping these suggestions very watery, very light. With thicker paint, I'll come in and paint in some of the shadows I see. I feel that those shadows on the leaves are really important to give us more of a three-dimensional aspect. To create those really dark markings on the walnuts, I pick up a thicker mixture of burnt sienna mixed with French ultramarine blue. And again, just a suggestion of those details. I add some of that dark mixture to the bottom of the chestnuts to help them look a little bit more three-dimensional. The dark shadows in the leaves, I mix more of that burnt sienna and French ultramarine blue. This is at maybe a skim milk consistency. It doesn't need to be really thick and dark. It doesn't have to be overpowering. And I'm painting in the shadows I see between those leaves. Then with a more watery mixture, I come in and soften that shadow into the lighter portion of the leaf. And right away, that leaf looks more three-dimensional. It has form. It's curling over on itself. I pick up more of that watery mix and do some of the detailing on the other leaves. Once we're at this point of the darkest shadows and the details, we're really towards the end of the painting. And there inevitably comes that point where you have to decide if you're done or not. The degree of detailing that you want to do is completely up to you. I like the idea of this being more of a suggestion of details rather than a scientifically accurate botanical painting. Here I'm working with just the tip of a damp brush, hardly any color on there at all. Just for subtle shading or softening of colors I've already put down. The important thing is that you're not going in with a brush loaded with water. If you have the habit of putting your brush in your water to clean it out often, be sure to also develop the habit of touching that brush up against your towel to dry it out. Hopefully you can see that as I add these subtle shadows, these leaves start to have more structure and more dimensionality. You really don't have to go too dark with these shadows. It's easier to go too light and then decide you need to do another layer than to go too dark and try to figure out how to lift it all out. And then for the final touches, I come in with that thick alizarin crimson and recreate some of the structure between some of the seeds, not all of them, in my pomegranate. And with these final touches, I'm done with my winter still life of a pomegranate. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and found it useful. And as always, thank you for joining me.